Hello, YouTubers. Joe Kersey here. About 12:30 in the afternoon on Tuesday, November 12th, uh, 2013. That's Eastern Time, of course. I want to basically finish up the video from yesterday with sort of a Chrestomathy of accounts, brief accounts that the veterans I've been fortunate enough to hear discussing their military experiences. To briefly sort of summarize those. I was very pleased to get an email, an extended email today from one of my subscribers, Jerry Meehan. And he made one good point, and I'm going to quote two sentences from your letter here, Jerry. And it relates to getting veterans to talk about their experiences, either mundane or violent, their military experiences, so that historians can have access to these, and the wider public can also have access to these, and perhaps a deeper appreciation of what potential sacrifices and sacrifices were made on behalf of the wider population here in this country. Jerry writes, anyone who didn't live through it won't have the complete and unique understanding that they do. But if not told, those stories will die with them. And then he raises a very interesting point about this current generation of soldiers. I think that the current generation of veterans who are a part of what I call the Facebook generation will be more willing to tell their stories because they have grown up in a social media dominated world where accessibility into the more intimate parts of their lives is commonplace. I think he's absolutely right. I think he's absolutely right. And I think we're seeing that now with a lot of the amazing helmet cam video coming out of Afghanistan, which, if you look around on YouTube, is very easy to find. So it's very interesting. I didn't hear, other than the Mr. Druho story I told you yesterday, I had never heard any veteran from any war, or for that matter, any line of service, talk much about their military experiences. So they were in the military. They'd say they were in the military, but they wouldn't talk about anything they actually had done. I think, I was going to do this in chronological order by war, but I won't. I'll do it by chronological order and when I first heard about this stuff. I guess the next time after, Mr. Druho was my 8th grade history teacher, Mr. Turkelson. And Mr. Turkelson had been and still was in the Air Force. He was in the Air Force Reserve at that point. He was a major in the Air Force Reserve. But he had been active duty Air Force, and he was a B-52 pilot. And he would talk to the class about flying, B-52 nuclear-armed missiles up along the Arctic Circle during his various tours of duty. And then then when he went to the reserves, he still flew. He flew every other weekend, and sometimes he'd fly transport planes. Sometimes he'd actually stay qualified in the big bombers. It's very interesting to hear him talk about how they trained to fly down at a very low level. I don't know if they still do that now, but at that time they were training them to fly, 50 some feet off the ground. Um, that was stealth technology in those days, and he talked about the flight characteristics of the B-52 extensively. It's it sounds like a fascinating aircraft to fly. So I went on to work for this guy for a couple, 3 years when I was in high school as a kind of a quasi-law clerk in his law office. After he finished law school and stopped teaching and then went into practicing law. And I did real estate title searches for him and his partner for almost 2.5 years. What a great job! What a great job! Did a little process serving, repoed a few cars. Well, that's getting off the topic. The next time I encountered it was actually when I was working in Fort Wayne, and I've told this story elsewhere on YouTube. It's about a fellow that was in my anesthesia group who had been in the jungles there in the Pacific fighting the Japanese, and he was involved in a lot of close quarter combat. At night, all of a sudden one of these guys is on you. And he had a flashback at a Japanese restaurant when the waiter tapped him on the shoulder. And he turned around and looked up into this Japanese fellow's face, and he had one of these flashbacks and had a fairly violent response to that. And, this was in 1979. That was 35, 38 years after the war. So he was still fighting that from time to time. The next time I think I've encountered somebody talking about their service was a fellow I met in North Carolina, and he described being one of these LRPs, long-range reconnaissance patrol guys in Vietnam, and going out, and he said a lot of times he'd spend 2 or 3 days sitting in a tree, and as he emphasized, dropping nothing, emphasis on dropping nothing, and he said occasionally he was able to get a shot at some of these guys. Of course, then he had to move once he took the shot, but he said it was very demoralizing for a fellow to be next to some guy in the jungle, and suddenly the fellow who's standing next to him, the head explodes. It's supposed to be demoralizing on our side too. Sure it is. But that was the first time he had actually talked about, I'd ever heard anybody actually talk about actual direct combat experience. The fellow who had the flashback in the restaurant actually didn't detail. I found out about that a lot later. He didn't detail it then. Another fellow from Vietnam named Dennis. He had been on a carrier in the Gulf of Tonkin. He was involved in carrier operations as a deck crew and handler, weapons handler, that sort of thing. And he talked about that. Now, they didn't see a lot of direct attack on the ships, but he talked about seeing the battle damage to the aircraft, and of course some of the ones that didn't come back. Then another fellow I actually had gone to high school with, I encountered him one day many years later, and he was a UPS man, and This guy was a year behind me in high school, and he actually was on one of the last helicopters out of Saigon in 1975. Talked about having to, you know, stomp on the hands of the people holding onto the skids there on top of the embassy to make them drop off so they could take off. You know. Then shoving the helicopter over the side when they got out to the carrier. There you are on that. And then the next time actually was Paul's dad. One night we were up to, that was when he and, I think Paul's mom had died by that point. I think this was when he and Helen, his second wife, were still living up in the corner house, and just out of the blue one night, Paul's dad, we call him Ed too. No, he's Ed 1. He's Ed 1. Anyway, he got talking about, you know, his experiences somewhat, you know, a few of them over in. See, what happened is he got drafted and then arrived over in eastern France, Belgium, just in time for the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. Now, he was in an anti-aircraft unit, one of these 40 millimeter anti-aircraft units, and but for a time there, he had to, you know, basically use his rifle, you know, and he talked about some of that, and actually getting down to where he had to use his 45 at one point, and of course, then later, you know, then that got squared away at a great cost of human life, and then he, for the rest of his time, he was more or less somewhat back from the front with his anti-aircraft unit, and talked about they shot down one of our planes by accident, obviously, and almost shooting down another one a plane was coming into land unannounced, and they were ready to fire at it, but it turned out they recognized it in time as being one of our guys. And it's called the fog of war. So I'm told. So I've read. Okay. Well, actually, I did get a bit out of order. In the mid '80s, I'd met a fellow who had been deployed on a minesweeper in the Persian Gulf. Back when we were patrolling the Persian, well, I guess we still patrol the Persian Gulf somewhat, but this was back when Iran was being very bellicose, and that was during the Iran-Iraq War, and you know, ships were getting fired on and so forth. Excuse me, he was on this minesweeper, and he said one interesting thing he talked about was on a typical deployment of 6 or 8 months on a naval ship, at least at that time, you often would have anywhere from 4 to 8 guys killed by electrocution, because everything on these ships runs it's electric, and you know, down in these entrance and exit bays on these minesweepers in particular, he says you've got all this salt water coming in and it shorts out this electrical equipment, and these guys get electrocuted. He said they brought back 6 guys in the freezer, you know, from the deployment. I mean, you think, oh, it's peacetime. No, well, no, it isn't really peacetime, is it, when you're doing that, is it? And then, you know, Paul's nephew and my honorary nephew, Ed Bennett, he's E3. He's E3. He's Ed 3. His dad was Ed 2, and Paul's dad's Ed 1. And his son's Ed 4. He was very forthcoming about some of his Iraqi experiences, and I'm not going to presume to speak in his stead. Tell what he said. But I felt very humbled and privileged to hear about that. And then, of course, Jerry and Denise have been very forthcoming about Denise's son, Andrew Mary, who was killed in Afghanistan. And Ed Bennett's posted a video with a list of the names of people from his unit that were killed on various deployments. So, God bless all of them for their service and sacrifice, willingness to do that for the rest of us. So on that, I think I'm going to conclude today's account and say bye-bye, YouTubers.